All right. Well, in the lesson for this video, what we're going to be talking about are some of what are the most common mistakes that are going to happen and that are made in the sampling process, as well as how to sample badly. Now, we're not talking about that because we want to sample badly. We want to have good samples. And so we're going to talk about what the mistakes are so that we can hopefully try to avoid some of these as we create our surveys and do our studies as a statistician. So, mistake number one that we'll make is to sample volunteers. Now, while this may not sound like a bad thing, the problem is that there are some issues with volunteers. First off, let's just talk about what type of sample this is. This is what's called a voluntary response sample. So if you recall in a previous lesson, we had talked about what were called simple random samples and cluster samples and stratified samples, and those were all good samples. Today we're kind of talking about what are some of the bad samples. So a voluntary response sample is where a large group of individuals is invited to respond, and then we just choose to include everyone who responds to the survey and in our sample. The problem is that can lead to what's called voluntary response bias. So voluntary response samples are likely not going to be representative. Even though every individual had a chance to participate, the problem is you're going to have some more extreme opinions in a voluntary response sample. To give an example of this, a restaurant might choose to send out a sample to its customer or a survey to its customers to see how satisfied they were with their most recent visit. If you think about the types of surveys that they're going to get back, it's probably going to be one of two types. You're going to get the people that were really upset. So something went wrong, their order got messed up, they weren't taken care of, and they want for the restaurant to know about it. The second type is the people that got really great service. They got all their food perfectly, everything was just amazing, and they want for the restaurant and the management to know that. And while I'm sure that is a part of it, you do have quite a few tables that are very happy, and I'm sure you have quite a few tables that are not as happy. You're not including any of those kind of average tables where they came in, they had a good time, but it wasn't spectacular, but nothing went wrong, and they just didn't want to fill out the survey, which is going to be a type of bias that we'll talk about. But response bias, you're going to get probably the extremes of your sample rather than kind of a representative sample that you want. All right, so mistake number two is that you sample conveniently. So when you sample conveniently, we call this a convenience sample. It's basically a sample where we include any individuals who are just convenient for us to sample. So if we were going to collect data on the heights of students in a stats class, we might just choose to sample everyone in our stats class. In fact, that was what we did actually about a week ago, was I did a convenience sample. You all were the easiest people to sample. I just had to send out a form, tell you to fill it out, and I got a whole bunch of data. The problem is that's probably not going to be representative in certain ways, and we'll look at that data later on to kind of see where that kind of convenience sampling might not be the best idea. So mistake number three is that we use a bad sampling frame. And when we use a bad sampling frame, we'll tend to get a sample which isn't representative, and that's why it's really important to consider whether you're going to do a simple random sample or a cluster or a stratified. See who it is that you're going to sample from, because you want that sampling frame to be a good sample frame. All right, our last mistake that we're going to talk about in this lesson, mistake number 4, is undercoverage. And so what undercoverage is that some of the population, some portion of the population isn't sampled or has a smaller representation in the sample compared to the population. So to give an example of this, maybe the administration at North was interested in how students arrived at school. And so to do that, they decided to stand out in the front circle drive and basically count how many students arrived in the different ways. So kind of count how many students were dropped off, how many drove themselves, how many rode the bus, how many walked, and so on. Now, pretty clearly, that's not going to be a real good sample, because in the Circle Drive, you're probably not going to have a lot of students who drove themselves or who got dropped off by a bus. Now, you'll probably have some that were dropped off by a parent or someone else, or maybe walked to school, but there's quite a few people that they're not considering in that sample. So under coverage, you're not getting to everyone. Not everyone has kind of a chance at being part of the sample. Another type of kind of bias that we're going to talk about is what's called non-response bias. So non-response bias is where participants refuse to participate, are not included in the sample. These participants are going to be left out. They may have different opinions than the rest of the sample. This happens a lot. In fact, you've probably been on the kind of bad side of a non-response bias. If you've ever gotten a survey from the school newspaper to your email, and I know you have because they send them out, and you just hit that delete button, you are part of the non-response bias. In other words, the results that the newspaper is getting aren't really going to be necessarily representative because there's a lot of people that just hit delete. That would be an example of non-response bias. You had a chance to be part of the study and you chose not to. That's different from response bias. So response bias is anything in the survey that might influence the responses. So that could be the wording of a question that leads to responses that you don't want. That might be false or incorrect information provided by the participants. So let's say you were in the school cafeteria, you were wanting to see what people's opinions were on prom last year. So you just start asking people, well, maybe there were some freshmen in your sample. And those freshmen have no idea how prom was last year. And so they just, being freshmen and being silly, just say, hey, prom was awesome. I had a great time. Can't wait to do it again this year. Thought the theme was great. Well, they really don't know what they're talking about. They're giving you false information that's going to bias your responses. So some things that we need to consider, some things that we need to look for when we're thinking about biases, is we need to look for biases in any survey that you encounter. And that really applies to both those that are conducting the survey and those who are taking the survey. As you're taking a survey, if you notice that a question is worded in a way that's going to lead to some biased responses, you might want to make the person who's conducting the survey aware of it. Hey, I answered this, but I think you're not going to get real great results, not accurate results. Especially if you're the one giving the survey, that's super important. So that's where if you are conducting the survey, you're going to want to spend your time and resources to reduce that bias. The third thing that you want to do, what you want to think about, is really in reference to under coverage, is you want to think about those who might be excluded. So for instance, if you're going to send out a survey, maybe you're going to start calling people to see what their opinions are. You might want to think about, while you're calling those people, there might be some people without phones. And so those members of the population without phones are going to be excluded. So maybe you have to do your survey in a couple different ways. Maybe it's part of its phone survey, part of its email, or something along the lines of like a paper survey. So you kind of have to think about how you can include kind of everyone in the population rather than just what's easiest. Because remember, convenience sampling is what's easiest, and that's usually not the best. Something else to consider, if possible, do a pilot run. And I think we talked about this in a previous lesson, was a pilot run is basically where you send the survey out to a smaller group of people to see what their responses are and make sure that the responses are what you want them to be. The last thing that you want to do and consider is that you always want to report the sampling methods in detail. And I think you guys saw this a lot in the homework, especially for those first few lessons, where there were some times where the sampling method really wasn't all that clear. And so it wasn't kind of clear what the survey asked, how it asked it, and so you weren't even sure what biases to expect. And so when you provide more detail, you're able to give more information about kind of what are the biases that might be in this survey, and here's what I did to avoid them is really what you want to try to mention. So to take a look at an example, thinking back to, well, not the first day of class, but I guess the first day of the first week, I guess, somewhere in there, you were asked to fill out a survey, had a range of different questions. What type of sampling was that? What sorts of bias would you expect in such a survey? And how would you improve the survey or sampling method to obtain more accurate results? All right, so the first question, what type of sampling method was that? I think I mentioned this actually earlier in this lesson. That was an example of convenience sampling. So convenience sampling is just whatever is easiest for the person conducting the survey. And obviously, as the teacher and you as the students, it's very convenient for me to just give you the survey and have you fill it out. So 2, what sorts of biases would you expect in such a survey? Well, you could expect a lot of different things. You could maybe have some non-response. In fact, I think there were maybe 1 or 2 people that didn't fill it out. So that's going to be one thing that we'll have to consider is that non-response. There might also be some response bias. Maybe if you weren't sure how to measure something, or if you were just kind of guessing at what your GPA was, it might not be all that accurate. That would be some response bias that could be there. There might even be some undercoverage. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that you could think about. Maybe you didn't have access to your MacBook, or maybe you weren't able to access the survey. Then you wouldn't have been able to take part in the survey because you didn't have the resources to do it. It's really, depending on how you want to look at it, there could be one of many different biases in that survey. So 3, how would you improve the sampling or survey method to obtain more accurate results? Well, we probably want to use some kind of a random survey, or random selection for our survey. So maybe not just sending it out to your class, but maybe sending it out to multiple classes and collecting data. That would probably help our results to be more representative of maybe Shawnee Mission North as a whole. We could also use a variety of sampling methods. Now this one's kind of hard to do right now. Obviously, I'm not able to just hand you a survey and have you fill it out on paper. But if we were having MacBook issues and we were in person, then I could potentially have those that had MacBooks go ahead and fill it out that way. Those that didn't, have them fill it out via paper. There's different ways that you can kind of avoid some of those biases. All right, so I hope that gives you kind of an idea of some different things that you can do in order to avoid the common mistakes and the bad sampling that can happen if you're not careful. We'll continue to talk about sampling. Next time, we'll be talking about the difference between what are called observational studies and experiments. Until then, have a good